Hello everyone, today we talk about the Spangenhelm of the late Roman army. So this segmented helmets, literally, that appear around the 4th century as a typology, and that spreads eventually during the 5th and the 6th century. The name stems from, in fact, these segments in the structure that you can see. These are segmented metal segments variably disposed, and this type of helmet is worn, at least from the sources far we can get, from the Sarmatian horsemen, knights if you want, even because of the highest level of armor that you can find out there at the time, represented on Trajan's column, right? And eventually it is to be seen also on the Roman cavalry of Galerius at the beginning of the 4th century in the art. So today's video is brief, actually, because we're not going to talk about the broader implications of why the Romans adopted this kind of helmet. In a sense, it's a good question and a non-question, meaning that, of course, the Roman army was undergoing important changes at this point. There are certain helmet typologies that will essentially will come to an end during the 3rd century. Others will, in fact, be present just around the 3rd century, and mostly there's this other, what we see conceptually as the 4th century army. And could speculate on this, but first of all, always consider this: a helmet is always a helmet, right? So it can't be that different in concept from one another. It can be heavier, more protective, like these ones that are definitely expensive in their kind. The Spangenhelm will have a great success even beyond these times in the same Roman army. As you know, it's basically the form that will remain by default, at least from a structural point of view, until the 11th century. Was a helmet that we mostly see in correspondence with a heavier typology of trooper in general, because of course at this point in the Roman army there are some changes that we can see for the more professional troops that tend to be, in fact, more heavily equipped, and a coming back, if you want, from, let's say, after a couple of centuries of important, material abundance, in a sense, to the necessity of producing cheaper, but also in larger quantity, and probably also with a greater availability, types of helmets, such as the intercisa types, or just essentially a skull cap. Not very different with what a Montefortino could be functionally, right, early in the day. So this do correspond to important changes which are not really a qualitative, let's say, fall of the Roman equipment and the Roman armament and military. Quite the contrary, because as I propose every time here, the Constantinian army, right? So from Constantine to Valens, more or less, the 70 years are 80 years roughly, are the ones which the Roman army reaches the greatest tactical effectiveness as a formula, and with a much greater increased offensive and defensive capability. So this split in the helmets, once again, that has always to consider that fundamentally at this point the Romans were also integrating completely, had absorbed all the auxiliaries within the Roman borders. Right? So what you see here is what you would have seen probably also among the auxiliaries of the early days, in terms of lighter equipment traditionally, even in the early empire at some point. And that the Romans absorbed, so that a typology of troops that the Roman army had literally to pay and equip completely for, and to provide also in terms of as a more statalized production. So the reason also why we can observe this by a certain standard is not reflective, again, of a qualitative decadence. It's just an expansion of the Roman army in relative terms to the type of troops that were levied from within the empire, and also from the outside, because in fact, as we've just said, the Spangenhelm is something that comes from the outside, right? It comes from these type of of these broader material culture that actually encompasses much more than just the steppes, right? It's also basically about the Middle East, the Near East, and we often give for granted, and that we discuss even in the video about the allegedly Levantine say Roman auxiliary archers, the typical Syrian ones have been depicted as such that, they had that kind of conic helmet with a specific structure. It's kind of similar even to the Spangenhelm conceptually. It belongs to that same philosophy, let's say, of armament that in Western Europe, I mean, yeah, it did exist in some forms as well, but let's say this gets all diluted. We should make a tree of all the various typologies. May also be misleading in categorization, but that we have kind of forgotten in terms of how spread it was, right? What we think of that typical helmet we see the auxiliary archers on the Trajan column might have not have to do nothing specifically to do with the Syrians, for example. It might have been, for example, as the latest historiography points out, actually a Balkan design, right? As we can find, there are, mostly we have this Sarmatian iconography from the Trajan column that shows what is properly more like a Spangenhelm. Among the trophies, the Sarmatian trophies, at least I presume, right, they can't be attributed just to the Sarmatians, but the Dacians surely had acquired them. I mean, here we're talking about military cultures that were such a close contact that you cannot say, this helmet just belongs to that people or not. Doesn't make any sense, just archaeologically speaking, or even for the sake of taxonomically, in a broader sense, and that belonged to a larger area that again stretched literally from the Sarmatian plains to Parthia to the Near East, and was there by default, right? And that in Asia Minor, also in the Balkans, right? And that was part of, one. It would be interesting to explain why this thing existed. It may not have to do specifically with any type. Of course, the structure does seem to suggest, of course, a more robust type of helmet in a sense, but this may be misleading. It's just probably about the composition. It's probably about the overall quality and kind of specific weight in terms of even of cost of effectiveness, considering that those were all cultures where there was a bit more of a kind of a feudalized military tradition in a sense. This may not be true, I don't know, for the Thracians, but it may be true it's mostly true for the Persified and Hellenized kingdoms of the East, besides Persia, in fact, itself, but Armenia or Pontus, but also for the Sarmatians that had always been in contact with those areas of the world since all these Aryan peoples of the steppes and waves had always also kind of invested the Middle East. This happened also, as you know, with Aryan's work that describes this, the islands invading Roman Asia Minor. So, in my opinion, there's not much of a functional reason for which these helmets are. I mean, a strictly defensive reason for which this helmet can say, it's against swords, it's against arrows. It's more about the probably the mechanism they were, the way they were built, in a functional way, right? In a way that could be, in a way, also more easily replaced, repaired, right? Rather, and that we're still a heavy typology of helmet in this regard that could serve the more professional troops that were being formed, considering that the early Roman imperial helmets, the legionary ones, were mostly designed for infantry, right? The Roman army at that point was fundamentally, the legions were just an infantry force, right? They had just a very tiny cavalry one, and albeit we do in fact we do realize that cavalry did have other typologies of helmet, preferably, which is relatively, it is to be seen in every case. This tended to be kind of more, in fact, I can't say anatomic because of course every helmet is anatomic, but for example the great neck guard that infantry helmets normally had, you can find them of course among the cavalry, but it seems to me that even certain Hellenizing typologies in general, so the masked helmets and also the Niederbiber types in the 3rd century, etc., are heading towards, and generally speaking, a greater cavalry bias. Right, the idea also of the big neck guard that the Romans took mostly from the Celts was already in there. Many other cultures, including the Italic one, but less pronounced, does suggest, considering especially the kind of tactics that the Roman legionnaires mostly carried out in the early empire, etc. More than that, there are different reasons in here. It's been suggested mostly coming from blows from the top. Right, which so suggesting the exposure to certain military cultures that made more use of slashing, kind of more open formation combat, which doesn't make much sense in the sense for how the Romans normally fought. Let's say in more thickly packed formations, and this neck guard is behind. So this is also being suggested. It's because the Romans had shorter swords, and therefore their fencing was much more like about grappling each other, almost physically, almost as wrestling, kind of making these cuts from behind the head, the nape, just as they would try to do with the tendons of their legs behind. So of course combat is a complex thing, and it's practically impossible to try to make sense of a broader, of the single elements of a panoply, just, without reconstructing the context and the broader, not just military, strictly, combat dynamics, but also what these helmets were fundamentally built like, for which production system and for which cost-effect ratios, right? So the Romans may have been exposed to other kinds of warfare that would have made certain helmets preferable, but in times where that form of helmet would have been ineffective from, and we tend, in a broader sense, and in fact we tend always to underestimate, as I was saying for the intercissa types as well, the collective functionality of this, because if combined arms increase, it's obvious that you need, for example, lighter troopers that you don't quite see before, aside from all the things that we also said about the pool of recruitment of these troops, that therefore do not maybe even need to engage exactly in the same way other troops do. So that's my take on the Spangenhelm, that also, as we were saying before, however, survives in the early Middle Ages, where that sense of the individual warrior, this kind of heavier type of trooper that remains central in a deeper sense, right? Also politically and socially, and that in the Roman army you can see, it was being distinguished also from the average lighter trooper. That is importantly functional too, because it's a very, it's a robust helmet. It does fit with the broader having of combat. It's practical. It's it does what it has to do, as all things that were brought into battle, right? It's just the way we have to determine in some form. So there are essentially two main types of Spangenhelm helmets. The one is the Der-El-Medineh. In fact, the most famous exemplars of the Spangenhelm have been found in Egypt, right? And about them we don't exactly know their time, the exact dating. We think they could vary between the 4th and the 5th century for this typology, this subtypology. So the Der-El-Medineh exemplar is constituted by 6 iron segments joined one another through a riveting, and as many radial metallic bands. And the tops of the segments are united by a disc to which a ring is fastened and secured, and while instead their bases are connected by an iron band that essentially runs around the inferior edge of the skull cap, and that hosts a T-shaped nose guard. And the cheek pieces are wide, enveloping. They're connected to the skull cap with a solid hinge, and this is really a very solid protective helmet. Especially the cheek pieces, if you look at them, they suggest they often the Spangenhelm eventually comes up with some male neck guard, right? You could attach or not, and you see also in the images this important skull cap protection, solid pieces that are meant to distribute, like to unload the impact of blows in a very resistant way, and that's just the birth thing, and this does the idea of considering the times for a cavalry helmet among most ones in use. There is a second exemplar of the so-called Der-El-Medineh type that is preserved at Leiden, and this presents a structurally similar skull cap, right, with 4 segments joined by a large cross, I don't say bolt in a sense, but in iron, but with very narrow, if you want, and even rough cheek guards. And the other type, Spangenhelm, is the Baldenheim one, that takes its name after an Alsatian locality, which first found dates to 1902, and that suggests a markedly Germanic origin at this point, and these helmets appear to be spread starting from the 5th century. Eventually, for all these are the kind of type that eventually we see so common in the early Middle Ages, right? So at this point, the Germans had drawn importantly a lot of Iranian, besides also Roman gear, and so the 5th century is just not a random century, because it's the moment of the great invasion, also this great push of the fact of the Sarmatians peoples, the domino effect because of the Hunnic invasion. So a great blending that had brought among these populations not just these kind of material influences, but also the political and social organization that would be militarily reflected by the rise in importance of the elite, and so this more heavily equipped, right, armored troops as well. So a reinforcement of the hierarchy of the same elite, and the Baldenheim type is constituted by some either 4 or 6 metallic segments in iron or bronze in various form. Never think that bronze in itself is better than iron as a statement, like it doesn't mean anything, right? It depends on how it's made, and bronze is actually better if you work it. It costs more in that sense, and that's also why the fortune of iron, because in a sense was good enough at some level. At this time, of course, then eventually with metallurgical developments things change, but let's say these metallic segments were fastened with rivets to a metallic band that closed in the lesser part of the skull cap, and the spaces among the segments that usually do not touch each other are covered with a series of characteristics elements in inverted T-shape form that basically are connected at the top of the skull cap. And the cheek guards are generally, rather simple and narrow, a bit as we've seen for the Leiden type. even if they could be, and they would often be, richly decorated. And all the helmets contained in the internal side of the skull cap and of the cheek guards a sort of felt or leather padding that was defined as cento by Amiens, 1988, that had the purpose to render more comfortable the usage, and especially to absorb the effect of the received hits. Let's say, as you know, organic material doesn't quite survive much, so we have for the ancient world, sometimes people say, but we don't have enough evidence for padded armor and things. I personally think it was much more common than we think, and we see it even just by so many iconographic sources that maybe do not tell us, of course, in a sculpture, but what kind of material that was. It's a problem we have even for the Middle Ages, even very late in time by a certain degree. Like, we can't understand, for example, what the first full horse armor, male armor is in fact male or something else. There's still a padding in some iconographic sources. So we know a few, and it's not so strange to know so few about such an early time, like late antiquity. And I think in general that the subarmalia, these kind of padded protections were pretty common, as a matter of fact, and there is probably not much of a difference even regarding to medieval times, where they're much better documented, because just they make a lot of sense. There was naturally an armor revolution historically, but the nuisances brought by wearing armor in general pretty much the same conceptually. So the padding is a pretty universal and logical concept. I can't see any specific material reason for which it should have not been used or developed, even just by a few, right? But and in fact these examples are kind of a proof of that. And naturally, padding armor is not just for comfort, but it's also for absorbing the blows, and that helps, at least, because you would still not like to get some of those blows, but it's still something extra for that. And yeah, I would say that, as you know, I don't have an enormous first of all, I don't have an expertise, but nor a specific inclination for let's say reviewing in detail arms and armor, but not much because I don't understand the relevance of it. I never want to give the impression to underestimate or to overlook the importance of the material side in warfare. It's just that when we want to look at differences in functionality, of course, these objects always had one, right? All of these designs, aside from the Spangenhelm subtypes, but also other types of helmets that we'll review, are always functional, are always practical. Even when there is an aesthetical element to it, it's still blended in to functionality in a sense. And it's almost impossible to distinguish. But at the same time, we don't have to be too rigid about and too positivistic about our capacity of understanding exactly why certain typologies were introduced. Especially from a strictly material, functional, physical point of view, right? We don't have to think that an armor was developed just in function of a specific combat situation, but rather the combination, at least for the single individual, because this is the point, because the armor is designed for a single guy. You don't have collective armor, right? Then you have in other ways, in a sense, in field engineering and all these things, but concretely, these guys, even if they were equipped in a certain way, they still fought together with others, right? So there were so many forces there that were interacting that it's obvious that certain, let's say, characteristics provide you with a certain functionality. The more armor you put on, the more it's extended, the more you want to cover certain surfaces, protect certain parts better than others, but you understand that some of these functions were sacrificed for things that were much more important in nature, right? For example, the early imperial helmets were very protective, but they had this important ear openings for uniquely an acoustic need, right? The fact that towards the late Roman Empire we see this disappearing in the heaviest types is very, very meaningful, right? Because it tells you at that point, especially for, in fact, these heavier types that did cover the years indeed, that also the tactical employment of these troops was different than before, right? That there was also this would point, you see, towards a form of individualism, right? But it's not quite the case, meaning that even if you look at, for example, medieval knight, because let's be honest, this is what the Spangenhelm in a sense opens to, right? Look at the Sarmatians and Trajan column; those are knights, right? And that's the mechanical model that will prevail, right, in the in that level of heavily armored kind of in fact mounted fighter. And these guys were more likely to have actually a higher collective training than the majority of other troops, right? This is debatable depending on who these people were, right? It's true that the asymmetry between the late Romans and other, especially the elites of these other Sarmato-Germanic peoples, was closing in, was decreasing. And so you would say, well, yeah, maybe those peoples, there was maybe a less of a training in general, so that armies began to rely more on individual troopers and so on. This is not quite correct in my opinion. On the contrary, that the collective element remained, first of all, there, and even if it decreased at some, maybe arguably at some levels, for example, the infantry later on, especially from the 5th century onwards, etc., because for the 4th that's definitely not the case. Still, the heavily armored horseman was dramatically trained, and it was trained collectively, right? So it's a bit like the 13th century medieval knight, the peak of that kind of properly of mounted warfare in that kind of heavily armored sense. Those guys had an astonishing level of collective training, yet their helmets came to be ever more close and completely close. Almost they couldn't hear or even see, because the eye slits also were quite narrow because of protection, etc. This doesn't mean that they weren't able to fight collectively. It's just that they were being functionalized to that kind of frontal attack and capacity also to pull out from engagement if the charge hadn't succeeded, and therefore line up again. And to do it means that to which they were actually also helped by field aides. Think about the squires that literally shouted them. It was a bit like in a tank, right? Look left, look right, watch out, because so the spread of such like helmets, like naturally the Spangenhelm is still very kind of ancient in nature. It's not that close, of course. They would listen, but they also in fact, the coordination of a cavalry charge would occur in a much more mediated way, right? That maybe was less coordinated with other types of troops, especially for these heavier types of soldiers, right? So maybe so that very intense combined arms tactics that existed at the time, definitely, and throughout all the Byzantine tradition, they're quite there, right? Especially for cavalry, and so would make these heavier troops kind of at the center of a bigger system, where the lighter troops kind of opened their paths in a sense and facilitated their charge, gave them that kind of orientation, and maybe was that that before would have been, let's say, more diluted at an average level, for which you would have needed all the troops instead to have the same kind of exposure, for example, to acoustic signals, right? For a guy who has literally to charge with a heavy horse, with a heavy armor, and let's say to perform that kind of frontal attack without diversion, because that's what he conceptually brought it on the field to do, even though of course it can perform so many other things. There are a few orders they have actually to listen to, right? They have to do mostly with the charge, right? And we're realigning in an area that they mostly have to see more than hearing the deal, or at least, even if they have to hear, they still have to hear orders importantly and for their lives. There maybe are other means, right, that you would sacrifice for maybe exactly this sake of for that need of protection, it was the same one that it was bypassed instead by the earlier elements where that hearing was more necessary for the individual. So and this does have to do with cavalry as well, right? Because if you're an infantryman, you're there and you have to, to assess a situation where also you can't really get out of. Whereas for a cavalryman, well, you have more autonomy, more maneuverability. You are just more individualistic de facto, because also you're more offensive, right? That's basically the only thing you have to be, literally. And so it's a complex issue that doesn't bring us to say, okay, well, the Spangenhelm was just functional specifically to this or specifically to that, but as a direction from previous types, like this kind of makes a bit more of a more sense. The Medineh type is, let's be honest, it's the most beautiful. It's the more intimidating. I definitely love 4th century armor. I must confess that a Constantinian equus to me is the best Roman soldiers ever existed aesthetically, but not just that, but also in terms of individual qualities. That's a hell of a fighter. But these helmets are really intimidating, fascinating. The Baldenheim type, it sounds a bit more jokey, like I don't know. But that's purely aesthetic. Of course, the functionality was there, and how it was. All right, but for today we stop it here. We'll keep talking about arms and armor in late Roman migration, all the times. For today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.